Let me. I've called my address a wake-up call, or the wake-up call that is Brexit. Maybe we should look at how we can embrace Brexit rather than actually run away from it. But let me tell you a story. Let me start with a story. It's a mild mid-October evening 17 years ago. A large crowd of mostly Irish, mostly men, had just heard a live interview in the IMI in Sandyford. David McWilliams had been talking to Jack Welch, who was in Dublin to promote his book, Jack, Straight from the Gut. Jack had just stood down from leading one of the world's truly great companies, General Electric, or GE as it's now known, after 20 years at the top. He led an organisation that at the time was doing over 200 deals a year. Nuclear power plants, aircraft leasing and engines, fridges, light bulbs, credit finance, a true conglomerate. He had given great detail not only to McWilliams' questioning, but to questions from the audience. He had stayed behind to meet and greet VIPs in the audience and to sign copies of his book. Between the end of his interview and the closing of the event, the audience, once they had their books signed, gathered around high tables set around the area in the IMI, and they ate posh snacks and drank nice drinks. Jack was finished his punishing schedule and was now ready to depart. His security detail signalled for the car to come to the front door. And on his way, his code name was Emerald, I think. It was either Emerald or Shamrock on the day, but we call him Emerald. He spotted deep-fried asparagus at the high table myself and a few other food industry colleagues had stationed ourselves at. He stopped. His security detail stopped. The car withdrew from the front door. He picked from the plates. Deep-fried asparagus, he said to no one in particular. My favourite, I love it. So I began a conversation with them. I asked him a few inane questions: weather, first time in Dublin, traffic. He asked what business I was in. I told him I was running a soft drinks business, a soda company, in his vernacular. More asparagus was eaten, more inane conversation, and then I asked him if I could address one point that bothered me. Sure, go ahead. Why, I asked, with such a spread of industry sectors and businesses under his control, under GE's control, why had they never got involved in food or drink? His answer: throws off great cash, but it's just too hard work. Compared to nuclear plants, jet engines, credit finance, food and drink was just too hard work. 2001. 2001 was before the artificial boom, the arrival of discounters, change for good from Tesco, the introduction of the euro, the removal of the groceries order by the government, the establishment of a food office in the Department of Agriculture, which Andrew now leads, before Food Harvest, a national economic bust, the pre-packed deal by Musgraves to buy Superquinn, which caused mayhem in the trade, Origin Green, Foodwise, and before Brexit, 2001. Even in 2001, the greatest corporate leader in the world, who grew the GE share price by 4,000% over his tenure, thought food was just too hard work. What did he see? Low margin, high retailer buying power, massive capex requirements, very complex supply chains and increasing regulation, the threat from private label, most likely all of those and maybe more. But he and no one in the room, I dare say, then would have thought of, could even have put a title around Brexit. The issues he may have seen it might have come from his own American lens, obviously based in America and being an American. If he, as a supreme strategist, were to oversee the Irish food industry, he would have seen all of the factors I just mentioned and a massive dependence on one single export market, with the UK taking still 35% of our exports in 2017. A market which is set in a cheap food policy since the end of World War II, which makes margin maximisation almost impossible. He would have seen a strong dependence on base or near base commodity products in milk and beef, an inability to control currency movements in many of its markets, an industry that focuses far too much on exports and ignores the relatively small trade surplus and for food and drink that delivers to the economy, but a significant trade deficit in consumer foods, i.e. products away from ingredients, meats and soft drinks and soft drink concentrates. A factor that's not really talked about by the public presentation of our food business. We have a trade deficit in a significant amount of it. And on top of all that, we now have Brexit, and Brexit will happen. Soft or hard, delayed transition, or by December 2020. It will happen. It may not involve tariffs straight away, or even at all, but even a free trade deal, a free trade agreement, post-transition will change the supply chains we now take for granted. Delays, cost inefficiencies of trucking, new packaging, reduced ability to leverage scale from combined UK, Republic of Ireland labels, promotions, recipes and so on, significantly increased margin pressures on the UK retail sector, working capital deterioration and possible employee movement restrictions for non-Irish employees working across an Irish company's UK operations. All of these will or are most likely going to happen. On top of this, there could be a significant rise in nationalistic support. For example, red tractor made in Britain, which will actually make selling Irish a bit more difficult. Brexit is coming and we need to be working very hard to be ready. And yet a recent AIB survey published last month suggested only 1 in 9 Irish food and drink companies are building plans for Brexit. Even if you don't export to the UK or at all, Brexit will impact on you and on all of us. This is not an export issue. Anyway, back to Jack. Jack Welch would have, in my view, a long time ago asked why we, if one could see all the various parts of this very complex, very sectoralised, very channel-driven business, which is the food and drink industry, why we weren't trying to be better strategically set up as an industry. Did we become lazy? Did we take status quo for granted? Did we take the fact that the English taste and the Irish taste is roughly similar, but did we take that for granted? Jack might also have used one of his favourite sayings. This is hard to say now after a few drinks. If tomorrow you don't like where you are today, what are you going to do about it? Brexit is our tomorrow. What are we going to do about it? In a sense, the tomorrow question is akin to a similar one that Jack Welch has used. If the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Slightly more catastrophic, but you get the point. Let's look at what's needed through a few viewpoints. The Irish state is doing a lot. Andrew Doyle, who I commend in his role and in championing food, the Irish has exemplified what we've done and gone through it. The Irish government is doing a lot. There's 1,000 inspectors and customs officials ready to be employed. Significant increased funds available since 2012 for Bord Bia, Enterprise Ireland and Teagasc, the 3 relevant state agencies. A much more engaged financial system, particularly as seen by European Investment Bank, albeit that being a European bank rather than an Irish bank. And indeed the Strategic Investment Fund, and considerable extra focus has been put on new embassies and Irish hubs around the world, 10 in total, which are going to focus on the food business, among other areas. There's also now, as Andrew said, a new multi-year funding envelope for Prepared Consumer Foods Innovation Centre, and that's due to be open next month. And indeed, the state system has now at last accepted that prepared consumer foods needs particular attention, which they didn't do until 2015. All of this is to be welcomed, but much more needs to be done if we're to avoid our tomorrow, if we are to match the rate of change externally with that internally, of the industry or of our own business units. At a policy level, because what I've just talked about is very much operational, more people, more offices. But at a policy level, the government needs to revisit our competition rules, allow companies to achieve scale, to buy each other, to coalesce, to operate in a combined way. It actually to promote scale, promote the removal of competition and look at coalescing. It needs to remove or certainly influence significantly the change in the de minimis rules from Europe. It needs to strengthen supports to prevent explicit or implicit coercive action by retailers and the buy side in general by extracting deals, ripping margin away from Irish suppliers, no matter their size. The regulations that are here right now are in no way adequate. And indeed, ironically, the UK powers within the grocery sector are much better and much more robust than the Irish ones. State aid supports need considerable enhancing, particularly for plant and capex, but also for extra personnel being deployed by Irish companies, not just by Irish state agencies, by Irish companies in non-UK markets to drive exports. More funds, on top of already achieved funds, need to be granted for the agencies, even above those already achieved. And a serious natural approach needs to be adopted to reverse the creeping inflation which hits food more than any other sector. Local authority rates, local waste charges, the cost of dealing with any changes from the energy network providers, insurance costs, so-called living wages, and so on and so on. We as industry participants, through the other lens, need to do a lot ourselves. After all, we can't always or necessarily rely on the state support to look after the most important industry of the Irish economy. It wasn't long after my Jack Welch encounter that I met with the then Minister of Enterprise, who's the current leader of the opposition. The then just published National Enterprise Strategy hadn't referred to food. and the ban on below-cost selling was due to be removed within a few years. And yet he said to me that just as Ireland had kept itself shod, even after the local shoe industry in Ireland had closed down, so too a food industry would always survive. There would always be food on the shelves wherever it came from. He obviously didn't care for Jack Welch's view or understand the work that goes into making food available throughout the year. So let's not fool ourselves that the state system will always be there and always has been there for us. We need to stuff ourselves. We need to significantly overhaul our supply chains, and it's very useful to hear Paul, who we've worked with closely in previous years in Glanbia, to give out some ideas. We need to significantly overhaul our supply systems. See where we can hedge, jettison, jointly purchase at a cheaper cost, outsource, re-engineer, leverage. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was while chairing the Board Beer Brand Forum in this hotel some 15 years ago. Lord Chris Haskin, who was then chair of Northern Foods, asked a large gathering of food executives who was actually buying cardboard. Hands went up around the room. And then he said, well, all the hands up, and most hands were up, who's actually buying it by themselves? And almost every hand stayed up. Why not collaborate on board buying? Why not collaborate on wrapping, indeed on all non-competing services and materials, and generate scale to reduce costs? We need to rip out costs everywhere. Prepare for a margin war in the UK if you're exporting there, and even here, if you never export. UK exports into Ireland of intermediate products will have a relatively lower tariff rate if tariffs do apply, and they'll have a currency advantage. So we'll be disadvantaged on both levels, currency and the relative tariff comparison between imports and exports. We need to rip out costs to protect our margins. We need to work together. We need to be allowed to work together. We need allowed to be allowed to build scale. We also need to consider, do we have the people skills? Do we have the working capital headroom and alliances in place to handle the customs checks, the new design requirements for packaging? A lot of the packaging issues that are out there are copyrighted by the European Union and will not apply to Brexit, will not apply to Britain after the March next year. The increased costs that will come from hauliers not being able to get the productivity benefits which are included in current costs from multi-load drops in the UK. And I must disagree at this point off script with the comment made earlier on. I don't think the Irish haulage system is as well prepared as was mentioned from the floor earlier on. And I certainly don't think they're actually close enough to their customers to be able to deliver on that promise. Do you have an agenda? Do all of us, any of us, have an agenda of product improvement, product development, innovation, product efficiency? Do we even have the people to do that? Or can we coalesce with others to deliver a pipeline of less and less commodity-oriented products? The canary in this particular coal mine, I mean the huge exposure to the UK for food exports and imports, began in 2008 with a 96 pence sterling. 10 years on, and over a third of all export value is still going into the UK, largely in base commodities. Some areas are actually growing. Beef is growing year on year. And the fastest growing part of prepared consumer food imports is in meats and dairy into Ireland, even after two national food strategies in the last decade. And worse, food exports from the UK into Ireland have increased by over 40%, according to the Food and Drink Federation, since 2015. The canary, I think, has fallen over at this stage. It's over 5 times the growth rate into Ireland compared to Food and Drink Federation exports into the EU overall. They, the British food and drink producers, have seen their tomorrow. They're helped by currency. They are reacting. They also have a 50 billion sterling fund to help them develop their business around the world by people and capex investment. We don't have that. Maybe we should have been more alert to the 2000 launch of Red Tractor and to the 2013 BBC Investigations report into spurious UK provenance in, say, Tesco pork, which received huge and widespread attention. And we should be more attentive to the exchange rate advantage that has been built up over the years. There's so much else we could be doing, and we've less than 220 days to go before Brexit happens, and no more than 840 days, including bank holidays, weekends, Christmases, annual holidays, sickness, family weddings, funerals, pregnancies involving ourselves or our colleagues, or both, machine breakdowns, customer meetings, backfillings. Less than 850 of all of those days put together before the end of the transition period. And only Canute would rely on a second referendum at this stage, overturning the first vote, and or only Canute would rely on an extension to the transition period. Extensions won't change the reality. We will be facing our tomorrow, Brexit no matter what. The alarm bell is sounding. The wake-up call for redirecting the whole of the Irish food and drink industry is shrill and loud. And it's time to get on with it and not be part of the 1 in 9 who have no Brexit insulation as of yet. I began with a story. As I come to the end of over 30 years of my work in FMCG, mostly in food and drinks, and reflect back on chairing the food and drink group within IBEC, on chairing the Prepared Consumer Foods Council, chairing the brand forum with Borbia, on countless meetings with ministers, department officials, state agencies, and working with some of Ireland's leading brands, I have another story. It's a story set in the future. I bump into, in this story, another industry titan with an international reputation for deal-making, investments in various sectors and countries, and continuous dynamic performance. And I ask her, or him, what's their opinion of food as an opportunity? And rather than deliberately avoiding the industry for all their investments, she or he wonders how they can invest further, quicker, deeper into the most dynamic, exciting and highly reputed industry around, and it's in Ireland. How can they do it here? Because that's where it's all happening. This business colossus asked me how it all happened, and the answer was Brexit in the story. It's our wake-up call. It forced us, government and industry participants, to rebuild, restructure, working more closely together, dynamic financial modelling as a solid base with trade working hand in glove to make Ireland a showcase of a sustainable, growing, exciting industry spread across the world with a range of high-value, differentiated, nutritious products and brands. And the we in this dream that I have refers to the many more food and drink companies getting involved in actively channeling, developing and challenging policy, and not just the usual suspects who end up at all the meetings. This story may be more of a dream than a reality, but Brexit is our wake-up call to make the dream a reality, and I know we all can do it if we put our minds to it. Thank you very much.